Well, hello everybody and welcome to another quick Python tutorial. Today we are going to discuss strings. Hopefully you've had a chance to read up on strings and text in general as it relates to Python and get a chance to look at the notebook that I have here on the screen prior to this. But we're basically going to be going through the notebook and making sure that you understand what's there and what you're going to be held accountable for and how you can work with certain things. So, strings are a sequence. Okay, there are lots of sequences in Python. Sequences are collections of things that are numbered, indexed, or they can be iterated over. So a string is no different. A string is a sequence of characters. So if I had something like a certain word, okay, or phrase, we'll say, and I say, welcome to class. Okay, and there's my string, a collection of characters. There are lots of different things I can do with it. Now today I'm going to work just simply in the console because strings are just variables, objects that you can do certain things with. Yes, you can apply everything I'm going to show you into the greater concept of an overall program, which you will do in due time, but I just want to demonstrate some of the different things that you can do with strings, the methods, the indexing, the substrings and slicing that you can work with. So strings are variables and or objects, I should say, and objects have lots of different things that you can do with it. Like I could change everything to its uppercase. So if I do .upper, right, it'll print it out and print it all in capitalized. How this is useful, let's say you want to do some validation and you want to make sure that everything's typed appropriately, but you don't want it to be case sensitive. Well, you can change whatever they type in to a certain case for yourself, like uppercase or lowercase, and they just check character for character. So I can do phrase.lower, and that'll change everything to lowercase. Notice it went back to where it was, but if I just simply print out phrase, I haven't actually changed anything because I haven't made any assignments yet. There are all sorts of different methods that you can work with. I would invite you to look at the Python docs here for all the different methods that you can do, but essentially here's some popular ones and what you can work with, but more importantly there are some other ones down here like find, right find, count, lower, upper, strip, right strip. These are just some of the methods that I think are more important. There are many others that you can work with, but they all work essentially the same way. You have a variable that stores your string, okay, and then you go ahead and use it by applying the method through the dot selector to your message, whatever it may be called. So phrase.upper, phrase.lower, or maybe we want phrase.find, and we looked for the word to, okay? It will tell us exactly where that ends up. And it says it's at index 8, which we'll talk about indexing in just a second, but it tells me about positions and how we can work with it. Strip and right strip are often very helpful. They tell us how we can remove certain characters from the string at certain points. Let's say it's an email address and we only want to validate a certain section of it, that there's like an @ symbol or something like that, so we might strip off the .com or the .org or whatever it may be, or maybe just strip off some white space and things like that. But those are different methods that you can use. Feel free to use them appropriately, whichever ones you need to work with. It is the name of the variable, dot, and then the name of the method, okay, followed by a set of parentheses. And then you would have to apply or put in anything that needs to go in those parentheses appropriately, okay? So, indexing. Sequences can be indexed, which means you can identify certain pieces of the sequence at an integer position. So let's say I came up with a given word, and yes, I make it equal to Python. Okay, just to keep it simple. Okay, I'll go Python programming. Just something a little bit different. Okay, so now I have this thing character stored, or the sequence stored at word, so you can see exactly what it is. Now indexing is just a matter of pulling apart the characters or the members of the sequence. Now to do that we use a square bracket notation, okay, not parentheses, not curly braces, but square brackets, and we can stick in an integer value, and when I do that it will tell me the member at that given position. Word at 3 pulls out the H. Well, H seems to be the fourth character, but the thing is, indexing a sequence always starts with index 0. So the P is at 0, the Y is at 1, the T is at 2, the H is at 3. So to prove that point, we can go word at 0, and you, whoops, and you can see it pulls out the P. Okay, and essentially I can type in any index I want, word at 10, okay, and it will produce it appropriately. And now if I do try to pull out an index that's too big, let's say word at 25, you're going to get an exception saying the string's out of range. You cannot go beyond the largest index that you have available to you. Python also does something a little bit quirky here. It will index things in reverse order, okay? So you can index things negatively, but notice that the indexing doesn't start at 0 on the right-hand side, it starts at -1. 0 has to get placed one side or the other, so we always put 0 along with the positive indices. Now, for if you want to do things in backwards, you can use negative indices knowing that the last character starts at index 1. So that's a nice way to kind of get the last member of a sequence every time, is type in the sequence name followed by at, or the square brackets, -1, and it will give you the last member of the sequence. But you can work your way all the way down as far as you want, word at -15, right, and it will produce whatever's there. For me, it's the H in Python, so there's the -15th character. So you just have to kind of be aware of what you're working with, okay? Now, another way to kind of get to the last character is to know how long the sequence is. There is a built-in function to that, okay? It has nothing to do with strings or anything at all. It is a built-in function to Python called len, and it will return the length of a sequence, and what that means is how many members it has. So if I type in word here, it will tell me exactly how many members there are to that sequence. Now, there are only 17 letters, but this space counts as one of the characters as well. So there are 18 overall characters. And if I did len of what we had before, phrase, since that's still a valid variable, we have 16 members. And so again, if I wanted to find out the last word or character in word, I could do word at len of word, and that would also get me to where I need to be. So the only thing that you have to keep in mind here is what goes in here must be an integer. Whether that integer is defined by you as being a 3 or a 10 or a 25, or that it's a function that returns an integer, or a variable that stores an integer, it doesn't make a difference how the integer is put into it. You just need to make sure an integer value is put in. And so if I go ahead and hit enter on this, oops, I must have typed something wrong. String index out of range. Oh, that's why. Because the len of word tells me 18, okay? But there is no 18th character. So if you actually want the last one, you have to type word, oops, let's get down there, word at len of word -1. So kind of a good error to show that the last character is not the length of the word because it's 0-based indices. The last character is always one less than the length of the word. And if I can get my syntax right, that would be quite helpful. So square off those brackets. And now we are missing a closing parenthesis. Oh, I put too many parentheses instead of a bracket, sorry. So put a bracket there. Now we've got something that works, and it pulls out the G in the piece. So these are all different error messages. I didn't mean to make this happen, but it's a good learning experience to see that errors are going to happen even to a seasoned developer or programmer so that you can work with them and notice what's going on. So that's basically how we can break apart a string, or at least pull out members, and this len function is going to be quite useful to tell you how many elements there are in a given sequence. It doesn't matter what the sequence is, we'll learn about other sequences as we progress through the course as well, but the length will always tell us how many members there are. And be mindful that the length of the sequence -1 will get you to the last member of that sequence. Okay, so now on to substrings. How can you pick apart a string or a phrase and get multiple pieces, or what we would call a slice of a string? So let me come up and introduce a new variable. We'll call it my slice. And we'll make it equal to, not Python this time, let's do pizza, because pizza has slices. Okay. Now, if I want to produce a chunk of this word, we do something very similar to indexing, but we specify a begin and an end. So we split the begin and end with a colon. Okay. So let's say I do something between 2 and 5. Okay, this means the beginning, I'm going to start at 2, I'm going to end at 5, 5, notice it just gives me the ZZA. So here we're at index 0, 1, 2. Finally, the 2 starts with Z. I go up to 3 and 4. I didn't get a bounds error here on the 5 because this tells me where to stop, not what to produce at that stop. So you'll get used to the idea in Python that we often have this stop argument, but we never really include it. So let's do something like my slice, and we'll do something maybe a little bit more obvious. We'll go between 1 and 3. Right. Whoops. And notice it just gives me the IZ. So it doesn't give me the character at index 3. It gives me the characters at index 1 and 2. Okay? The way I always like to think about it is I start here at 1 and I go up 2 but not include 3. So for me, I like to subtract these two numbers. 3 minus 1 means 2. So I get 2 characters or 2 elements in my slice. Okay? So that's just an easy way for me to kind of remember it. There are some shortcuts to this. Let's say I wanted to get a slice from, we'll do this, my slice from 0 to 4. Okay, it produces PIZZ, but I could also do the same thing doing this. And I just put a colon and a 4. There's no reason for the spaces, it's just I think looks better. But if you don't provide a beginning value, it will always start at the beginning. Okay. Subsequently, the exact same thing is if I do not provide it with an end value, let's say I do 2 colon nothing and I don't put anything there, it will start at 2 and go all the way to the end of the sequence. So it's a nice way to get a chunk of it from the beginning or to the end while starting in a given position. And again, these do not have to be straight numbers, hard-coded numbers. They could be variables like index equals 2, and I could go my slice to index. So again, you could pass it a variable, and it does exactly what you want it to do. It will give you a slice from 0 up to, but not including index 2. All right. So that's kind of it on strings. There's another section down here. You can also, index things negatively. You just need to make sure that you always have on the left-hand side a smaller number than what's on the right-hand side, a bigger number, like -5 to 3. We'll index something from -5 to 3. So y up to, but not including the h in Python if we were looking at that. Now the last thing that I have here is the idea of mutable versus immutable objects. Strings are objects. Everything in Python is technically an object, but strings, like in most programming languages, are objects, of course in Python and in others. But in Python, objects fall into basically 2 categories, mutable versus immutable. Mutable means that you can change the object. Now we haven't had any mutable real objects yet, other than, well, no, we really just haven't. And immutable objects are objects that cannot be changed, so you can't do anything with them. So, for instance here, let's say I had a word and I made it equal to game, just to kind of show what we're talking about, okay? Now, I could go and print that word, no problem, and I can change that word to lame without any issue. Whoops. And you might think, well, I just changed it, so it must be immutable. But the problem is I didn't actually change the word. I changed the entire variable that's storing it. I completely destroyed what was in word, and I reassigned it to something else. Now, to prove my point, let's go back to where word is equal to game. Jeez. Okay. And let me attempt to change just one character from the word instead of the whole word itself. So what if I went word at 0 and attempted to change it to an L to give me the exact same thing from game to lame? Now this gives me a problem. String object does not support item assignment, and that's simply because strings are not mutable objects. I cannot change a string unless I destroy the variable that I have and reassign it. So there's ways to get around this, and that's where you kind of have to get creative with your programming techniques, but you cannot go through and change that. Now there are structures in which you can, for instance a list, okay? And a list is just a collection of things, okay? Maybe it's a collection of numbers that are held within square brackets. I could print my list, and you can see that it is just a collection of pieces, but I could go into my list at index 3 and change that to a 10, right? And that doesn't seem to have a problem. And there's an example of a mutable object. Notice how the 1 changed to a 10 because the item at index 3 now changed to a 10 instead of what it was. So there's kind of the differences between mutable and immutable objects. Strings, you cannot do things via index to change them, but with other objects you can, and we just have to get experience with those other types of objects. But know that we always fall into 2 categories, mutable versus immutable. So that's kind of the skinny on strings. There's not much to it in terms of using it in anything else. You'll just have to make sure that you can use these topics, these tools, in the broader sense of some program. Maybe you're trying to break apart fields in a form or deal with validation structures or whatever it may be. It's the methods, it's the indexing, it's the slicing that is going to help you accomplish those results. So essentially this is nothing more than just another tool to put in your toolbox that you will use in the greater context of something else. So hopefully that helps you understand strings a little bit better, but feel free to ask questions with anything that you may need and read the notebook a little bit more detailed and hit those Python documents up so that you can see all the different methods that you have to work with and play around with. So hopefully that helps, and we'll see you in the next tutorial.